I think we're good to go here. It's 4 p.m. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Right now, I am at the School of Music in Austin because the Wi-Fi is better. So if a squirrel like runs by, I'm sorry about it. Came for the good Wi-Fi. So I just wanted to first introduce myself. Most of you probably I've met because it's probably all of my friends out there. So thanks for showing up. But my name is Sarah Hetrick, and I'm a saxophonist and educator, and I'm based out of Austin, Texas right now. And I also want to thank the CSW and Alexia for sure for helping put this all together and for inviting me to talk. It's such a wonderful idea to have the series, and I'm very grateful to be a part of it. So thank you. And then the last thing I just wanted, well, I guess I have two more things, sorry. I just wanted to draw your attention in the chat. There should be a link to the slideshow that I have shared. I would recommend pulling it up on whatever device you have, whether it's on mobile or whatever, just so you can zoom in because there's some advertisements that you may not be able to read along because they're pretty small, the text is small. So I recommend pulling that up for yourself. And then just the last thing, I just want to put a little disclaimer out there that when I talk about gender throughout this entire presentation, it's in a historical context of a binary, and I just want to acknowledge that I do not view gender as a binary. And so if I talk about it that way, I'm happy to talk to you later if you want to have a conversation about that. But for the sake of this historical context, I will be mostly referring to it, gender in a binary. Trying to figure out my technology. Okay, there we go. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the trajectory of how I arrived at this little piece of my research. And oh my gosh, I forget how old I am sometimes. I guess it's more like 4 years ago. I was gonna say 2 years ago, and that's not right. About 4 years ago, I was reading this dissertation by Yoko Suzuki, and in it, she discusses not only gender, but race, and a bit towards the end, she talks a little bit about sexuality or sexual orientation too, and the performativity of it among female jazz saxophonists. And I found this dissertation to be incredibly interesting. And so I put it up here so that if you are interested in reading that, you can check it out. But I'm including it mostly because Yoko's research suggests that the social environment that a young saxophonist is in can heavily affect their perception and expression of their identity. And so when I think about the saxophone and the way that it is perceived in popular culture, one of the first things that comes to mind is the sexualization of the saxophone. So that, in addition to sax, the prefix sax and the prefix sex being used interchangeably when we talk about the saxophone, led to my question of why is the saxophone so often sexualized? And this is throughout history and still today a very prevalent theme when saxophonists, or I guess I should say outside the community, more in popular culture, really, this is a theme that comes up all the time. And I think about the possible implications it has on a performer, a young performer, specifically an instrument that is so sexualized that throughout history has implied a certain role based on gender. It really got me thinking. Just a broad look of some of the topics that I explore in this area of my research are the sexualization of the saxophone throughout history, as well as the saxophone and symbolism as it relates to gender, or the iconography of the saxophone, and how that implies certain sexual themes or themes that relate to gender, and the public perception of and attitudes towards the saxophone, and something that's closely linked, the saxophone in media throughout history as it relates to gender. So for this specific presentation, I'm focusing on print media and that of the 1920s and Butcher and C.G. Kwan advertisements of the saxophone. So further, a few things that we'll touch on are the economic, social, and cultural influences on gender in the 1920s, Busher, CJ, and Kahn advertisements. And to do that, we're going to look at these ideas separately and look at kind of what was going on at this time economically, socially, and culturally. Some things that I theorize to be of influence on these advertisements, or just the way that the saxophone was perceived in these advertisements, are first post-war novel entertainment and extra income, the jazz age and dance band culture, the women's movement and the new ideals for women, and how that led to a new sector of consumerism, people making decisions to purchase things that otherwise weren't in the past, and of course, advancements in advertising and marketing strategy. So to start, just take a look at what the economic climate was at this point. World War I had ended in 1818. And then the 20s starts, and there's this huge economic boom. A lot of us are familiar with this period of time and how prosperous it was and how progressive a lot of things happening were. So at this time, some of the things that allowed for saxophones to become this huge craze were the mass production infrastructure, saxophones and a lot of different things, goods being made, just this whole economic is exploding, partly because of the mass production infrastructure that was resultant after World War I. And then, of course, expendable income. An entire working force comes back after World War I, and this prosperous time, a lot of people now have income for what they may have deemed extra before. I'm maneuvering my notes and my slides here. And then we look at entertainment at this time. And culturally, the turn of the century is known for an obsession with exoticism and novel entertainment. So especially around the turn of the century, we see a lot of things like vaudeville productions and theaters, popular theaters. And into the 20s, of course, dance band culture and the development of jazz, which had been happening already, but is a huge time for development of jazz. People in America had extra time and money for recreational and leisure activities. And so there's a huge demand for hobbies and ultimately dance halls. Dance halls were really popular at this time. And what was happening in those dance halls were, of course, all of these new dance moves. And a lot of the dance moves that were being seen were, of course, quite sexually suggestive comparatively to the way that people had been dancing. And so in this dance hall, what music is being played? Of course, the saxophone is there. So these two become synonymous in a lot of ways, and at this point, inextricably linked. So these sexually suggestive physical gestures and the saxophone. And the saxophone, as we know, is quite phallic in nature. So all of these things together kind of put us in this position. So just to kind of exemplify this, we're going to look at some quotes from San Francisco Chronicle. And this article is quite iconic. I'm sure some of you may have read it already, but it really exemplifies these cultural trends and further the link between the saxophone and these gestures of dances and the sexual gestures that are seen in these dances. So you can read on your own. I'm just going to read out loud. No other musical instrument can be so moral. The saxophone is guttural, savage, panting, and low in its appeal. The abstract immorality of the saxophone is but an example of the power that gilded sin has for the moment over thoughtless minds. It continues there. It's just a very direct statement, possibly more direct. The saxophone preys upon the passions and emotions. It becomes patently suggestive, instinctively animal-like, and possesses some strange psychological power over the young dance devotees of America. And it continues to draw a very direct example between the music that's being heard and played by the saxophone to sexual activity. So again, this is published, widely circulated. This is an idea that becomes quite common. we look at another example, this is a headline that comes from a 1921 publication of Billboard. And today we know Billboard as the Hot 100, right? But this is a publication that has been around for some time and is essentially a music business publication at this time, but was widely read and widely circulated. So, so this outlet has this article on the saxophone, story of the saxophone. The subtitle there, does the spirit of Satan lurk in its seductive tones? So of course, drawing a parallel between seduction, the saxophone, Satan, the saxophone. And then an extract from this, just to read a small part of it. Some psychologists claim that the very spirit of Satan lurks in its seductive appeals and mellow tones. University deans and matrons even go so far as to try to bar it from use as an instrument in student organizations, claiming that the cause of the saxophone, or excuse me, jazz craze is found in the immoral vibrating tones of the saxophone. So all immoral, everything about this situation that's immoral is because of the saxophone. So those are some very explicit examples of how these two ideas of sexuality and the saxophone become very much on the same, synonymous. So the cultural phenomenon of popular music alone is perhaps a catalyst, but not the only reason for the saxophone's popularity in America. We'll look at the saxophone again in a bit, but I just want to draw our attention to the women's movement at this time. So the new woman is kind of a term developed in media, and I have a picture here of a Gibson girl, and the new woman and Gibson girls are both two icons, again, that were published in media and then adopted generally by media anytime that the women's movement at this time was discussed. But the Gibson girl here, and the Gibson girls, that comes from a collection of artwork done by the artist Gibson, and they depict these new ideals for women in the 1920s. And so here we see a woman riding a bicycle, which to all of us is like, okay, but at that time that was pretty taboo. A couple other in the series demonstrate women abandoning their domestic chores for more creative or professional pursuits, which again to us is okay, but at that time that was very progressive. It was quite liberal. So the point that I'd like to make here is that there's a huge turn from Victorian ideals of femininity to ideals of femininity in the 1920s or through the turn of the century here, and that Victorian ideals mostly revolve around domesticity and the essential femininity, and more specifically essential femininity being an ideal of purity and modesty. So there's a shift here, and women become more independent in a lot of ways. So just taking a closer look, of course, we know the 19th Amendment happens here and women gain the right to vote. And then the huge change that I want to focus on is women gain choice in a lot of ways. So I focus on the ways that they gain financial, social, and sexual freedom, and eventually how that leads to a surge in consumerism. So women are finding themselves having the opportunity to make choices in what social arenas they spend their time, how they spend their money, because that is now a more acceptable idea that as a woman, I can go out and purchase what I want, or I have the money and I can choose how I want to spend it. And then of course, sexuality as more of a, maybe we can think of that in terms of modesty and how women present themselves physically, which is kind of an outdated way to think about it, but contextually it works here. So moving on though, this entire group of Americans are now consuming in a different way. So I just want to talk a little bit about consumerism. in that we talked a little bit about mass production and how that affected the economy, but looking more specifically at now there's a huge availability of goods, more than in wartime, of course. And so there's new methods, for display, packaging, and advertising. More specifically, think methods like mail order or door-to-door operations, chain stores, department stores, all of which can completely change consumer activity. They led to these methods, of course, but they created another social arena for women to be in. So much of the advertising that was done aimed at this new sector of consumers, aimed at creating some feeling of desire, or as I have written here, a systemization of desire. So I think it's important to look at, okay, if the trend is to develop this system of desire, then who's making those choices? Who's exploiting these changes in women's freedoms, where they're spending their time, what decisions they're making, who is influencing that? And so we looked to a new workforce at this time, which was the post-war, male workforce. There's an entirely new professional and managerial class that's spurred the growth of corporations, and within that, marketing and advertising functions. Because before this, marketing and advertising didn't exist at all in the same capacity. So there's a historian by the name of Kathy Pace, whose research I read quite extensively when I was working on this, because she is a historian who focuses on American consumerism. And she writes that at this time, the efficiency, method, and control of this new field, this advertising, was a major source of masculine identity, because this workforce that developed this field of advertising was made up of these post-war workforce. So really, this new workforce, again tied to the masculine identity at this time, is controlling how women are perceived in media, how they perceive themselves, and the decisions that they made when they were consuming. Yeah. So moving on here, just looking at the kind of how this all happened, embracing femininity, the women's movement started to redefine femininity and what the ideals were to be in American women. And this change and this freedom and this new expression, freedom of expression, led to advertisers exploiting the common femininity between women. So erasing the differences among women and exaggerating what they have in common over what they have different between them. And this, of course, stresses the difference between the sexes. And advertisers at this time were aiming to unite women in their supposed universal desire for beauty, their inherent taste, and their natural sense of duty to the family's well-being. All right, there's a little bit of wind. So essentially, and cover my mic. Hopefully you can still hear me. Maybe Alexia can chime in and let me know if it gets bad. But to sum up, there's a selling of the lifestyle that was not happening before. Summation here, consumption was no longer the purchase of goods, but the way of a way of life, selling a lifestyle again. And shopping was no longer a functional activity for necessary items, but it was a leisurely or social activity. And again, an arena for women. They had the choice and the freedom to be engaging in this type of sphere. So to get into the advertising, the advertisement specifically, I just want to talk a little bit about what I'm focusing on, and then the process I took in analyzing the advertisements. So this time there's really two vehicles for advertising, radio and print media, which radio was a massive impetus for the circulation of trends and popular culture in itself. I can't look at both of those things. There's not enough time, but we're going to look at print materials. So newspapers, of course, already existed, but in a different way. They're now being used for advertising as well as disseminating information and news. And then the other print material that we see is the magazines. And to compound what I said earlier, not just magazines, but the mass production of magazines and the accessibility of them. This is a huge opportunity for advertisers to access a larger audience, a wider breadth of consumers. So when I started to analyze these advertisements, I wanted to go about it the right way and learn how to properly analyze an advertisement. So just to walk you through a little bit of my process here, in a general sense, I was looking at the context of the advertisement, what was being depicted, what was the situation, what's the purpose of the advertisement, what's the tone, the arrangement, and location and scale here refers to its position within a publication. So is it with the wanted ads? Is it with the other advertisements? Is it in the middle of the news section or the politics section? Is it put on the backside between two pages of a short story, which was a really popular aspect of publication at this point, aimed at women, of course. So that's what arrangement refers to there. And then, of course, text, the typography or font size. Typography being the type of font, but moreover, does that font elicit some type of thing, like thinking about like Times New Roman versus Comic Sans does have a very different tone to them. And then, of course, the relevant themes that I was looking at that are, and these relevant themes here are common among advertisers. These are two themes that are analyzed in all advertisements or utilized in all advertisements. Those being the merchants of cool and the myth of the ideal. If you buy this thing, then you will be your best self, or you will receive this thing, or all of this, you know, this object will give you this intangible thing. So continuing on, the analysis for gender in these, and again, I recognize that I'm referring to as a binary here, and that historically, for the context here, I can do that, but I just want to acknowledge that I do not consider gender a binary. But looking at the context of the advertisement, again, the audience who's looking at this advertisement, who's it intended for, what kind of consumer? And again, I mentioned earlier about the polarization of stereotypes based on gender. This becomes huge here, where the way that a figure of a certain presenting gender, the way that that is advertised towards somebody specifically becomes, I guess, exaggerated here, which we still see a lot of that today. But then, of course, the people, how they're dressed, what's their appearance, their body position, body language, the gaze, which becomes quite important in these particular advertisements, the subtext, often from suggestive language use or wording that's used, and then the actual text, the written language. So we're going to start with, I'm pretty sure these go in chronological. Let me check really quick. Yeah, okay. So if you weren't here at the very start of the presentation, I don't know if anyone has joined, but there is a link in the chat for this presentation so that you can zoom in on the advertisements and read what I'm reading. So need to pull that up. I'll give you a second to pull it up, and I'll pull it up because I accidentally X'd out of it. Okay. All right, so this first advertisement here, if you zoom in on it, we're going to see a lot of common themes here, in addition to what I just discussed about analysis. And those are the saxophone will help whoever purchases the saxophone gain financial or financial success or popularity. So this particular one is advertising that with the saxophone you will become more popular. And in the text, if I read the small print there, it says a Bush or True Tone saxophone will enable you to take an important part in the musical development of your community. It increases your popularity and your opportunities as well as your pleasure. And something that I want to point out in particular here is that a comparison of saxophone advertisements at this time to other instruments, and this type of language was not used for any other instrument. So words like pleasure become quite a signifier for perception of the saxophone, or the way that Busher and C.G. Kahn were utilizing public perception of the saxophone to sell the instrument. So again, opportunity, it says that you'll take part in the development of your community, making you an essential part of your community if you have the saxophone. And then looking to the actual picture that they use, you see the figures here. There's a male presenting figure who is dressed in a suit and who is well groomed, playing the saxophone. And then you see the gaze of all of the other figures directed towards the saxophonist that is playing. All the attention in the advertisement is put on the product or that person playing the saxophone. And then, of course, we see that there are three women, women presenting figures in this advertisement here, and their dress is what I would say is considered stereotypical for a feminine identifying person at that time. Looking at more polarized stereotypes of femininity and masculinity, which are presented here. Looking at the next, I should say, sorry, Redbook Magazine, we know now to be a different kind of publication, but Redbook Magazine was more for a general audience at this point, not specifically targeted towards one gender. Moving on to the next one here. Is from Hearst International combined with Cosmopolitan. And similarly, Cosmopolitan, that as we know it today as a modern publication, is targeted in a certain fashion, but during this time it was targeted towards the general audience. So if we look at this one, I date my success, writes a successful young bonds salesman, to the day I bought my Busher saxophone. Selling success, again, financial or social gain here. It did two things for me. It gave me a stimulating, worthwhile regulation. It gave me a social advantage that has made me hundreds of friends valuable to me in my business. So not only did he gain friends from the saxophone, it enabled him to gain 100 friends. So of course, the male presenting figure is the saxophonist in this picture. And again, he has gained the attention of many of his friends there, and it's been valuable to him in his business, financial gain. And the gaze, of course, in this one is the woman sitting, or the woman presenting figure sitting at the piano. The gaze is toward the saxophonist. So again, a lot of the same themes are happening here throughout them. And it's that the male presenting figure, all the attention is on them. The stereotypes of gender presented are more polarized on a binary of feminine and masculine. And there's promises of social, financial gain. So, again, Cosmopolitan here, at this point, it becomes an independent publication, but is still targeted towards a general audience. And if we look at this advertisement, if you want to zoom in there. we start to see some type font that becomes a little suggestive. So the italics are implying some certain tone or inflection, signaling out you, what would you give for this, the saxophone, or that scene there, I guess I should say. And the first line there is popularity plus in all caps. So again, promising some sort of social gain from the purchase of the saxophone for what we see to be the male presenting figure who's playing the saxophone. Says, the glad hand of welcome everywhere, the undivided attention and smiles of those whose smiles are worthwhile, that's the happy heritage of the fellow who plays a Bush or two-tone saxophone. And with this one, the gaze is certainly significant because of the way that they include the undivided attention and the smiles of those whose smiles are worthwhile. So implying at this point some social gain targeted at a specific gender relationship between the male presenting saxophonist and the two women pictured in the two women presenting figures pictured in the top of this advertisement. And I think that it's most significant because the gaze of both of those women are on the saxophonist and not the pianist playing. Again, same kind of promises in that one. So this next one is in Popular Mechanics, which Popular Mechanics was a publication targeted at a more masculine identifying audience, or historically speaking, a male audience. So if we zoom in there on that one, this might be some of the most suggestive wording that we've seen, similar to the San Francisco Chronicle article that we looked at earlier. Says, boy, which the type font is suggestive in itself, as well as the, when we see that, we all know how to say that because of the implied inflection. Says, the lore of jazz is yours with Bush or saxophone. Young folks are enamored by its tantalizing tunes. They love that syncopation. So similar to the use of pleasure earlier, this particular advertisement is using some type of subtext that it's implying seduction. And of course, it's seduction from the male presenting figure towards the female presenting figure. The body language of this one is significant as well when we're talking about the context of that, the tantalizing tunes and the way that is advertising. If you buy the saxophone, it will enable you to have this kind of relationship with another person. And in this case, it shows us pretty explicitly who that other person would be. So, and again, Popular Mechanics is targeted towards a male audience. So having that knowledge allows us to assume that this advertisement is also targeted towards that audience. On to another one. This one was in Better Homes and Gardens, which again, now we might not think of it as a general audience, but at this time it was read by a more general audience, and the content that was published in it was intended for a general audience. Which to me, when I started researching this, I saw all these titles and I was like, oh, I know that publication. Then I thought the audience was women. And I was confused as to why these would be advertised towards an audience of women. But then when I did more research on the publications themselves, it made a lot more sense. So I'll scroll to the next one here. So again, we'll zoom in there. And in this picture, we have what looks like a trumpet player, a trombonist, and a saxophonist. And the gaze of the woman presenting figure, who is in stereotypically feminine dress for this time, her gaze is fixed on the saxophonist. And of course, it says quite directly, play a con and get ahead socially. So implying that with the purchase of this con saxophone, you will have some sort of social gain. And then it continues, popularity, pleasure, profit are all yours when you play a con saxophone. So these ideas of selling financial, social, and it's what we could say is implied to be sexual, they're selling all of this through the saxophone. So again, the inclusion of the word pleasure in here is unique to saxophone advertisements at this time. Moving forward, another Hearst International combined with Cosmopolitan publication here towards the end of the decade. And if we zoom in, we see again the same kind of theme. So other fellows had left him in the social background. Girls avoided him. He was missing all the modern fun. Then one day he read an advertisement. It held out a promise of popularity if he would only learn to play a Bush or two-tone saxophone. So again, the treatment being a male presenting figure, gaining social, romantic in this case, it seems, and just that then. I was looking maybe financial again, but no. So the same kind of thing. Again, presenting figures are stereotypical for that time as far as masculinity and femininity goes. So again, in each one of these, the roles for the presenting or in what we would perceive as a gender are pretty much in line and consistent. Okay, now we're going to look at something a little different. So there weren't many advertisements where there was a saxophonist who was a woman, but there were a few, and the treatment of them was significant and different to that of the ones that we looked at earlier, with the male presenting figure being the saxophonist. So if we zoom in here, this one is a con advertisement, and says con saxophones won success for this dainty feminine band with their clever leader Bert Earl playing this week. It says where. So again, polarizing this binary and giving pretty specific roles to the presenting genders here. So dainty feminine band, a pretty implicit, or sorry, it's implying a specific type of stereotype there. And then their clever leader, their very intelligent, very wise leader who is a male. Of course, their dress is, this has been copied to death, so you can't really see the detail of that image, but they're wearing dresses, and the leader, Bert Earl, is wearing a suit. Again, presentation of gender here is quite polarized in masculinity and femininity here. So I think about this, why I keep saying this is because if a woman does play a saxophone, then what I'm, as a consumer at this point, I would have to be on that extreme of femininity in order to be successful like them, which is not, of course, an explicit directive here, but definitely an implicit one, and one that's intended through these advertisements. So looking at the text that continues, con saxophones require no hard blowing nor effort to play, a fact evidenced by the smiling ease of these graceful women performers. And I didn't go much into attitudes towards music as a career for women, but this pretty much exemplifies the whole thing, is that women are allowed to play an instrument, but only if it doesn't distort their face or get in the way of their appearance. So things that are phallic, like the saxophone, or things that do have to distort the face in a way, are not favored for women. But here, Con says, no hard blowing effort to play, a woman can do it and remain gracefully intact. So looking to the next one here, we look at a specific saxophonist by the name of Ruth Glanville. Whoops. So for Ruth Glanville was a popular performer at this time. When I did research women saxophonists at this time, there were a few others who have been researched, like I think Louise Linden, who Thomas Millig has done research on. If you want to check it out, I think it has been published several times in the Bessie Mecklem as well. But his work has been published in Saxophone Symposium. So if you're interested in learning more about early 20th century saxophonists who are women, other than Elise Hall maybe, I would suggest looking at his work. I digress. So Ruth Glanville is the only woman that I could find that was endorsed by Conn. And so here we see Ruth Glanville. It says, Miss Ruth Glanville, Queen of the Saxophone, a feature. It says where she was, but I want to read further down where it describes her. Cannot express my great love for this instrument. I have played other makes for several years, but now I wonder why I ever played them at all. This Conn is truly wonderful and is perfection personified. So the language that she uses is maybe what we might consider traditionally feminine, which I don't want to get into feminine endings territory and approach that. But the way that she's depicted, especially in her picture, where her gaze is towards the saxophone, is pretty iconic for this period of time, where women who are instrumentalists or endorsed by a company are kind of paying homage to the instrument itself for doing the work. So if we look at another, this is of course not an advertisement, but I think that I like including it because I find it interesting. It's just a reception of Ruth Glanville, one of her performances. So if you zoom in there, the treatment of her as a saxophonist in here, I argue that it may be different than if she were a man, the way that she's received. So I'm referring specifically to where it says, added to her musical ability towards the end there, text about her saxophone playing, but then text this on at the end. Added to her musical ability, she presents an attractive appearance, carrying several costume changes classily. If you look at the next one, it continues with this kind of language, and it says, for the finish, Miss Glanville makes quite a flash with her costume, wearing tights underneath, a shimmering skirt of corded material. This hangs in strings, permitting the legs to move, not the legs need permission to move, with freedom, and giving the audience the style of abbreviated dress or being naked. Underneath, Miss Glanville plays all the time. She moves about, and eyes of the audience are not always glued to the instrument, which is pretty direct as far as the review of her and the treatment of her as a woman identifying person. So I don't think in that one it doesn't really talk about, it says, yeah, it doesn't really talk about her playing at all, which is significant because I would think that similar review would be of a male identifying saxophonist may not be treated that way. So here are two like artist rosters, if you will, from Conn, in which to further exemplify this, if you're a saxophonist, you're a male, unless you're a lady saxophonist. If you look at the bottom left, you zoom in there, everyone else says their name and then where they're from, what kind of position they hold, or saxophonist from Chicago or saxophonist in this band or whatever. Hers says her name and then lady saxophonist. No other saxophonist in this artist roster qualifies the artist by their gender, only the one woman. And then the one on the right, a similar treatment where they are listed on the left with their qualifications, and then it says, if I can't totally see that, it's a little, but Ruth Glanville, feminine virtuoso, truly wonderful. Of course, she's the only one that is referred to feminine, that points to her gender. Everyone else is just a saxophonist. So just to conclude a bit, and I'll get to your questions, which I hopefully you asked some questions, but the symbolism shown throughout the 1920s represents a starting point for this theme of the saxophone being sexualized. It kind of lays the groundwork, and the intersection of these, the women's movement, economic prosperity, all of these changes, cultural changes, the jazz movement, kind of position the saxophone in a way that is unique to any other instrument and allows it to stick out as synonymous with these kind of sexual ideas. So saxophone really becomes a symbol for social and cultural change at a time when sexual freedom and discovery is central to American life, which I would argue sets the trajectory for the future of the instrument as a sexualized symbol in American culture. So I'd love to take some questions if you have any. I'll look in the chat here. I will stop sharing my screen. Oh wait, I think I can see them. Okay, there we go. Okay. Question from Sarah Griffin. Hi, do you know if Buscher's use of these advertisements were more successful than competing companies? That's a good question. I'm not sure if I would be privy to that information as far as like comparative analysis of like what was sold versus so if you have an idea of how to access that information, like the gross profit or whatever of one company over the other, I would love to. I've talked to Scott Campbell before about some kind of archival thing dating back to Con, but there isn't really much because of moving facilities and that type of thing. But if you have an idea of how to learn about that, I would love to hear from you because I do think that would be a really interesting point. I will say that Buscher and CG Con seem to be kind of the dominant manufacturers at this time. And again, if you know a lot about the production of saxophone throughout history, I would love to talk to you to learn more about what else maybe I'm missing or should look at. Let me look at it. Okay. Hi, Allison. Is the sexualized ad style unique to the US? Did you happen to see if Europe during what was presumably a significant Reconstruction periods advertised similarly or elsewhere in the world? Yeah, awesome question. So thinking about like, if I were to pull up my paper, it's probably like 40 pages and I just, it's really just on the American advertisement. So I would love to explore this more. One resource that if you're interested in this, I might suggest, I'd have to look up the title of it because Allison asked that question. I can send you the information for this resource. I can't think of the title of the book off the top of my head, but it's basically a look at the saxophone in not only like the advertisement of saxophones specifically, but saxophone in advertisements by other companies throughout history. And it does, I'm pretty sure it was written, it's originally in German and I read it, the translation in English. I'll have to send that to you, Allison, but it's actually Dr. Page is the one that suggested that resource to me because I didn't know about it, but it does have a section about American advertisements of saxophone and the thinking about like Nazi Germany, which was like obviously a little bit later, but the iconic image of the saxophonist and the black monkey that is associated with that basically exhibit of band artwork, and I think that image is super iconic, but it includes it in there and it includes some other examples throughout the world. So I know I didn't really answer your question, but yes, absolutely. I'm not sure if it's unique to the US, but this type of like type of thing, I have been looking at it more internationally, I suppose you could say, but I haven't delved too deeply into that. Grace, hi Grace. What are some similarities and differences between those advertisements for the saxophone and compare? Oh yeah, so sorry, she says, what are the similarities and differences between these advertisements for saxophone and comparable advertisements for other instruments? So I think the most significant thing I guess I'll start with is that there's not really this kind of advertising being done for like a trumpet or so like that. There are, but they're usually it'll be like a listing of type of instruments for sale, and it'll be like trumpet. Here's how you can mail order this, or a trombone, or some of the other instruments that they sell, and more just like an informational advertisement. So looking at this, or pianos similarly, I looked at some piano advertisements that were run quite frequently in publication throughout the decade, and most of those were more informational based or like educationally based, where it was like piano for your student, piano for learning, blah, 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 that sort of thing. And there are advertisements like that for the saxophone as well, but I found this to be rather unique, the treatment and representation of gender, this type of positioning figures in a way that would basically providing something intangible through a tangible purchase type of thing. That treatment is pretty unique in my understanding to saxophone specific. But if you see anything else, I'd love to look at it. If you see something like a trumpet's advertised in this way, I would love to see it. So does anyone else have any questions that I can answer or try to answer? From Sarah Griffin on Facebook. What are some resources, databases to find advertisements like these? I'm interested in exploring the topic more. Sarah Griffin, I haven't met you before, but I'd love to meet you. I love that you're so interested. Most of these were accessed through ProQuest, the historic newspaper database. There's a pretty comprehensive holding of digitized newspapers from the US, anywhere from before the turn of the century to modern day. So, and I have my bibliography is about as long as the paper itself. So if you'd like to see that, I can, Sarah Griffin, email me or send me a Facebook message or something. I'd be happy to share the bibliography with you if you'd like to look at some of the advertisements within the context of the newspaper itself, and to see what exactly the entire newspaper was looking like. I'm not sure if access is available without some sort of institutional support, but I think, which is an issue, but I'm pretty sure that if you are like at wherever you live, your library, your public library will probably have some way to access that type of digital archive. But I can help you as much as I can. I can try and help you as much as I can. So if you're interested in looking at them, I'm happy to send them, and I'm happy to help you find access to look at them. Hi, Dr. Frigo. Just a minute now. Okay, so Dr. Frigo asked, I'm curious how your perception of today's treatment of the instrument and its players aligns or not with your research from the 1920s. So I haven't, so basically this is a small portion of a much larger project. So I mentioned early in the presentation that I'm looking at sexualization of the saxophone throughout history. So trying to, although I realize in real life, the world is not chunked by decades. That's kind of how I'm going. So eventually I'll work my way to today with a similar kind of analysis. But to try and answer your question, Dr. Frigo, I think that a lot has changed, but I think that failing to, as far as the perception of the instrument itself, but I really don't think that as far as today's perception of the instrument as a sexualized one, I think it's such a complex history, especially one tied to popular culture, and as an instrument that kind of is certainly not original to the US, but in a lot of ways embodies like an American identity. I think that we can't really divorce the history of the saxophone in the way that it has been sexualized from the way that we perceive like today's treatment of the instrument, because it's I think it's a best case scenario. I think it's important to learn about it and understand how that perception has changed or what it has been throughout the decades. But today, I don't think think of today we think about like iconic saxophone solos in popular music. I think when we think about the perception of the saxophone today in comparison to the 1920s, I think that might be the closest as far as like the saxophones signaling some sort of like often seen in film for like some sexual scene or some sexually suggestive lyrics in a popular song, that type of thing. If you're interested in learning more about that in particular, Dr. Adrienne Honnold, which I'm sure you know, Dr. Frigo, her research is really interesting, and it kind of tackles that kind of the implications of saxophone in more modern cultural context and how that affects the way we perceive saxophone as it relates to sexuality and gender. So yeah, I don't think it totally aligns. I think it's definitely evolved, but I think that history does creep out sometimes in little pieces. So I think it's important to be informed and understand how that trajectory has happened over time. Grace asks, what are some of the implications of these advertisements for the saxophone world today? Okay, so similarly, I think it's definitely evolved, but I think about for so long, if the saxophone is perceived as an instrument for this one type of person, and I'm not that type of person, then does that mean I can't be a saxophonist, or does that mean I'm not as good of a saxophonist as this person who is perceived to like I look nothing like that saxophonist in all those advertisements? So although it's 2020 and that is 1920, I think that the way that, and I can only speak really about my experience as a performer and how like the sexualization of the saxophone, what I perceive it to be, to affect me. I think a lot of times as a woman saxophonist, not so much now because I feel like I'm more comfortable, and the more that I learn about it, the more I'm comfortable in my own identity as a saxophonist as it relates to my gender. But I think sometimes I felt some pressure to push to that side of like femininity, or in a lot of ways like having to perceive myself as more of a performer in the context of sexuality rather than just as an artist. So thinking of myself like I have to look a certain way and act a certain way and have certain feminine mannerisms when I play. I think for a while I kind of carried some of that, but now the more I understand, I don't have to be like that, and there's so many people I can look up to who have not had to conform to some one type of woman who plays the saxophone. If I don't have to conform to that, then the more confident I am to not be hyper feminine when I play, I guess, if that makes sense. Cool. Anything else I can answer? All right. Well, thank you very much for, thanks, Grace. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. If you have any other questions that you think about later, or if you thought of something that I didn't cover, I'd love to talk to you. Just reach out. Oh, hello. Thank you. Thank you. I'd love to talk to you if you have something that you think I should look at that I have not, something that I should consider that I have not. Whatever, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, thank you.